Chris Morgan-Jones writes thrillers set in the world of corporate investigations and business intelligence, spying on business, if you like. In his second book, The Jackal's Share, his central character is hired by a charismatic billionaire to investigate the billionaire himself to prove that he's nothing to hide. Turns out, of course, that he's rather a lot to hide, and it all ends predictably messily. Corporate investigations is a world that Morgan-Jones knows well, because he spent 10 years working for Kroll, one of the world's leading business intelligence consultancies. Chris Morgan-Jones, you used to work for Kroll, which is an investigations company. For those who don't know, what kind of business is that?
We used to find things out for clients. Clients who'd lost money, or clients who were having disputes, or clients who were having trouble of one kind or another. And what was needed to help them was information that was difficult to find. And we'd go and find the information and apply it to their problem.
Is this is the closest analogy espionage and spying, or detective work?
That and journalism, actually, is a little bit like what you do. It's using information from the public world, from databases and from Google and what have you. And most importantly, talking to people to figure out what has happened and sometimes what's about to happen. So it was interesting as a job because sometimes a client would say to you, what is the risk of doing this thing? In other words, in the future, how might things play out? Sometimes they come to you and say, what has happened? And can you find, usually, the money that has gone missing?
Now, one of the things that you used to investigate were schemes involving money laundering, I think, and that's something that features in your first book and, to a degree, also in this second book, the sort of situation where you have a plausible front man who is helping to deal with the ill-gotten gains of corrupt politicians and businessmen and so on. How common is that?
Extremely common, everywhere. I tried as an exercise for an article I wrote for a newspaper a couple of years ago to determine how many there might be. And I think there are probably between 50,000 or 100,000 operating in the world. But on every case that we worked that was remotely interesting, one of these characters would hove into view.
And they're interesting people because certainly the instances in this book start out, as it were, morally compromised and then try to put their morally compromised beginnings behind them and find that they can't.
Yes. It's a very old secret that will stay dead. And I think that's true of all these people, is that they start life as professionals. They start life as accountants and bankers and lawyers. They've been trained, they're respectable. And at some point, they take a client or a job which leads them down a path which their younger selves would not have countenanced. But once they've taken it, it's extremely difficult to go back, and it's impossible to hide. Trails of money stay around forever.
You are very interested, obviously, in the kind of moral ambiguities, not only of these people, but of the people who investigate them. And one of the things that, the topical things in this book, it seems to me, is that your fictional investigator, he's called Ben Webster, is a thoroughly reputable fellow working for a thoroughly reputable company. But from time to time, when desperate, he goes to a private investigator, a man you call Dean Oliver, who uses the sort of techniques one suspects, phone tapping, bribing officials and so on, that we've heard an awful lot about in recent years, particularly journalists, newspapers doing it, private eyes. Is it possible to do the kind of investigations work that your fictional characters do and that you did for real without resorting on occasion to these illegal means?
Yes, it is. And actually, the illegal means hamstring you in a couple of ways, and Webster in the book, I think, discovers this. You can't use information that's been illegally gained terribly easily. There are instances in the British courts where judges will say, OK, that information you didn't acquire properly, but I will allow it into court. Really? That does happen, has happened on occasion.
And under what sort of circumstances?
I think when the jeopardy is great and the person and the potential damage against a reputable person, a reputable body, great as well. So if you are, if an investigator was working for a large blue chip company, a British company listed on the stock exchange, owned by pension funds and what have you, and on the other side was an obvious fraudster who had taken lots of money from that business. And for some reason, and this happens as well, it hadn't been possible for the larger reputable company to interest the investigative authorities, the police, in such a case. Under those circumstances, a judge might say, OK, the larger crime is the fraud, and the lesser crime I will choose to not ignore, but I will choose to put to one side and allow the information that resulted from it. And I should say that Kroll, reputable companies of that kind, probably won't take that risk because it isn't worth their while, but there are investigators in London who will.
The other aspect of this, perhaps, that's been in the news recently is the Edward Snowden case, the revelations of what government spying agencies are finding out about us, about our emails, our communications, and so on. Presumably, all that information that the National Security Agency, GCHQ, and so on have, potentially, that's not available to anyone in the private sector.
No.
But the interesting thing is that Snowden himself was working for a private contractor.
Yes. And if I was imagining the novel that I might want to write about that world, it might feature a character like Snowden who perhaps had been paid by the private sector to reveal such information. That's not impossible. So when I say that organisations of the kind I used to work for don't have access, it's not an impossibility, but I think it is a fact now that they don't.
You say you used to work for, but actually you've gone back to that field, haven't you? There's a successor company to Kroll called K2, set up by Jules Kroll, who founded Kroll and his son, and you've gone back to them as a consultant. What's the appeal?
I'm a strategic advisor. The appeal is largely that it keeps me current with what's happening in that world now, apart from the fact that I like the people very much and the work. And as an author, your income is a little less stable than you might like. The main attraction is that it's fascinating, and it's fascinating in terms of story and character, which are the stock in trade, stock in my new trade, I should say.
You've been likened by friendly critics to John le Carre, and one can see the connections there. You also liken your own work, you say, we were talking before, to P.G. Wodehouse. Now that I do find that hard to grasp.
Only in the most glancing manner. No, the first book features an investigator called Ben Webster, as does the second. But the focus of the first book is very much on Webster's quarry, his target. And the second book, the focus, I think, is more on Webster himself. And in the third book, which is currently being written, the focus is on Webster's boss, Hammer. And something that P.G. Wodehouse did, le Carre did it more obviously, and I think is a more obvious sort of predecessor and influence. But something that P.G. Wodehouse does very well is set up a world in which you may be sitting in one part of it, glimpsing on the other side of it characters who you already know. And I think there's something rather pleasing about that, both for the reader and the novelist, because it gives the novelist scope, and it gives the reader the security that they are in a place they understand, but that the stories in it will be different.
An unlikely analogy, but I wish you luck. Chris Morgan-Jones, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.